I just thought I'd take a quick minute introducing myself. I know I've had an opportunity to see so many of you, in recent years and the welcoming environment. But just a little bit about my background and how I ended up in the public defender's office. I'm also, much like Molly, basically a product of the Bay Area. I grew up in Santa Rosa. I've lived my entire life in the Bay Area, but I was the son of two lifetime public servants. My mom was a teacher, an elementary school teacher for 25 years. My dad was a social worker for 35 years. And then I ended up attending UC Davis, both as an undergrad and then Martin Luther King Hall Law School. I started my public defender career up there in Yolo County, and then ultimately came down here in 1998. So I'm going on about 26, 27 years in this particular county. I actually met my wife in the office, and we raised two children in this community. So this is the only legal job I've ever had in my life as a public defender. It's the only job I ever wanted. It's a tough job, as you can imagine, and as kind of Molly laid out. But I will say it's the only job I've had in my life where I wake up on Monday and didn't count the days down to the end of the week. I usually start my Monday thinking, gosh, I'm not going to get done everything I want. And actually always share that. We're sharing that today with a whole group of interns that were in our office. So I feel it's a great privilege to do this work. And I really want to acknowledge Molly, first of all, for inviting me and mentoring me and having me join our leadership team. I spent some time as our felony team supervisor, but in about 2017, I joined the administrative team for the office, and through Molly's really support, got to do some innovative projects. For instance, helping launch our first post-conviction team. So really looking at, again, in this holistic model and the history of the criminal legal system, what happened, especially during the 90s, during the mass incarceration movement, and what obligation do we as a community to redress what happened years ago? And that's really what our post-conviction team looks at. How can we return people safely to our community? The other thing is, as Molly mentioned, the community outreach position or attorney. I was able to help launch that, and frankly, I want to acknowledge Chris. Chris spent a lot of time mentoring me and sharing ideas and perspective on how the prosecution team worked and what felt like the right lane for our office to have outreach workers. And then in recent years, I've been fortunate and really, again, both through the support of Molly, but our county, of really looking at race equity work from a deeper perspective. And so I want to share a few observations and a little bit of history. I promise I won't be too long. I always come with more slides than I need, but I'm going to cut through them. But there is actually a reason why I have as much information on the slides, because, maybe I'll just start with this point, that we need to send an important message that race equity work is not a flavor of the month discussion. And what I really, when I come into community, I want to talk about what we're doing in our office to emphasize that, but I also want to be a spokesman for our county, that this is not a flavor of the month approach to this work. There is a lot of time that has been invested at the national level and that we have leveraged as a county to move this work forward. And so some of my slides are going to be too busy, but I use that to show that this has not been kind of half-baked ideas by a handful of people who, boy, because of the George Floyd tragedy, we're going to get into the room and we're going to get on media and talk about this. This is real work, and it's generational work, as I know the people in this room know better than I. In fact, frankly, I would be remiss not to start with really saying that I feel like I owe a great debt to the people in this room. If it weren't for people like Victor, Bob, Rose, Tony, Raul, Herman, if all of you weren't the leaders and the trailblazers all along, I wouldn't be standing here today giving a presentation like this. we wouldn't have an office resourced the way it was and look the way it was, and we wouldn't be working as a community to basically, or as a group, to improve our community. And it's through support and partnership, but frankly, the struggle, the decades-long struggle that was pushed forward by the people in this room, in particular Victor, but so many of you, it really has allowed me to stand here today and share some of the work that what I'd call is kind of the fruit that has blossomed from a lot of your work. Okay, race equity work and some of the action plan and the organization in our particular office. What is race equity work? I know I'm preaching to the choir, and I know that many of you already know this, and I'm going to go kind of through this briefly. I'm just going to summarize this point, because I get sometimes these arguments about, is structural racism real? Is racism, are you really talking about that intentional person who has bigoted or discriminatory attitude towards another individual? And yes, that exists. But in some ways, from my perspective, that's not the core problem. The core problem is the structural element of racism. And where and why we know it is real is because every metric of success in our society, race is a predictor of outcome. So if you want to take a bell curve and think about whether it's wealth is a metric of success, health as a metric of success, involvement in the criminal and entanglement in the criminal legal system, I can tell you that if you look at race, where people will fall. That tells you there is structural racism at work and why we collectively as a community need to address it. And that's really kind of the point here. In particular, and why transition as it being uniquely important to organizations like the Public Defender's Office is because government, frankly, has been at the root of much of that. It's the policies and practices that government has pushed forward for 50, if not 100, 200, 300 years. And I'm going to have some concessions and confessions a little bit later. But we're at the root of it, and so we have to be at the front lines of solving it. And that's why, in particular, this work feels so important to me at this point in my career. These are some of the underlying concepts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is oftentimes a slide I'm using, again, when I'm talking with people more new to the concepts or trying to introduce some of the concepts. What I do, obviously, I make this point that the plan is to develop an organized action plan. I do like to highlight the bullet point number 2, which is this inward, outward facing discussion, which is I like to use this lighthouse, glass house concept, which is when we're doing this work as an organization, as the Public Defender Office, I think of us as a lighthouse in terms of how we are serving the community and how a race equity lens should be used to help guide our decision making, how we serve our clients. That to me is the lighthouse component, but there's also a glass house component, which is we have to look internally at our own organization and how our own employees are thriving and how we foster a healthy environment for our own employees so that we can better serve the community. So it's both outward-facing and inward-facing work from my perspective. The other items I would just kind of highlight, and I oftentimes kind of close on this, but there's obviously no one-size-fits-all solution for any organization. There's no silver bullet solution, and it's not a purely linear process. And this is what I mean, is I got more deeply involved in the organized effort of this work. I can remember calling up my friend, Dr. Ana Lilia Garcia, who is now in charge of the Office of Diversity and Equity Belonging. She was still at Public Health at that time. And I said, listen, I really want to move beyond this academy work that I'd been involved in, and how do we move this work forward? And I started talking about, this is kind of a lawyer mindset, and this is part of my confession here today. With Gabriella's invocation, I feel like, and as a former altar boy, I feel it's appropriate for me to do that. But I sat with Dr. Garcia, with Ana Lily, and I said, I have this idea, and I'd really like to come up with a plan, and I've got this vision of a phased approach, and I'd like to be here in 12 months and here in 14 months. And here in 36 months, and she kind of looked at me and said, I want you to think more broadly and really said, listen, this is a problem. If you step back for a second, this is a problem that is at least 400 years in the making. You are not going to solve this problem in 2, 3, or 4 years. In fact, it was moving my mindset from thinking of this as potentially a sprint with some stops along the way to potentially a marathon. This was going to be a long journey, and really accepting that this is going to be a relay race, that we are going to hand this work off generationally, and we are going to move this work forward generationally. So I think about this iterative process, which is because there's not a clear finish line, we're always using the same concepts. And I'll talk about a little bit about the GARE model, which is what the county's using, is what we are using, which is the Government Alliance on Race Equity, and their iterative process, their kind of core foundation of looking at normalizing conversations about race, organizing, developing infrastructure to do race equity work, and then operationalizing that. Those are the 3 core concepts. I have a slide in a minute about it, but it really is important for me to accept and for me to acknowledge we've got a lot of work, and frankly, the work isn't going to be done while I'm still in government, but I hope to move it substantially forward. What's the county plan? The county plan, in essence, again, was rooted in the idea that government's at the core of a lot of the inequities that exist in our society. So part of the solutions begin in government. Let me add as an aside, though, and one of the reasons why it's so important for me to be here and to do the work that Chris and Molly talked about in the community, government cannot solve these problems alone or without engagement with the community. It is a partnership that is going to be critical to this process. But the county has basically adopted the GARE philosophy. I would encourage anyone who's more curious, because today's not going to be the day for me to get into how the GARE philosophy necessarily works or all the details of it. It's a nationwide network of basically race equity practitioners who are supporting jurisdictions all across the country. Our county has become involved and is actively participating in this network. And it's due in no small part because the county executive first established the Division of Equity and Social Justice. So we're talking about the offices of Women's Policy, Immigrant Relations, the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, the Office of Cultural Competency, and then most recently, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging. That's the office that's run by Dr. Garcia, and she is the one who is going to lead our strategic work in this county, our race equity work. We're working on that this year, Chris. We spent a lot of hours over the last 6 months, and we've got a lot of hours ahead of us, but it's good work, and we are going to develop a strategic roadmap and a strategic plan over, basically, we're about 6 months in, about another 6 more months, we're going to have a plan that's going to be delivered to our County Board of Supervisors. And again, by the way, it is being done with community. It is not just government representatives in those meetings. Talk about GARE. This is one of those busy slides, basically to say, again, this is not some half-baked idea that Damon came up in the back room with some people in his office, but that we really are trying to operationalize a philosophy that is tested and proven successful. This is what I referred to as kind of the iterative process of normalizing conversations about race, operationalizing, and organizing. I just want to quickly make 2 points. People say normalize, what do you mean? And I say, well, go into any, I'll just use the courtroom example. Go into any courtroom and start talking about implicit bias in race. And the very first response you're going to hear, and Chris, I can see you shaking your head, is, are you calling me a racist? It's very difficult conversation for people to have, and I can do this, or I can say this from my personal perspective, and my perspective as a person with white privilege. It's very difficult for white people to hear that, and that is not asking for an apology. That is the reality, and I look white people in the face all the time and say it is real. And you need to open up your ears, you need to close your mouth, and you need to listen, because there's very different perspectives out there, and we all need to learn as a community, but in particular, it probably needs to start with the white community. And so normalizing these conversations is critical, is having these conversations and saying, I'm not going to get defensive. All of us operate with some level of implicit bias, and we need to explore our own implicit bias to move this work forward. The other thing I want to highlight is the operationalizing component, which is the application of race equity tools. So it's not just come up with, I feel like maybe I'll do this. I'm going to start a diversity, equity, and belonging committee, and maybe we'll have some cultural celebrations in the office, something like that. Equity tools are used to help us apply an equity lens to decision making. And we went through an entire baseline assessment that was facilitated by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging, where we had representatives from every unit in our office, not just the attorneys, not just the investigators, not just the paralegals. We had clerical staff. We had people from I shouldn't even say top to bottom. We had people from across our organization involved in that assessment. And then from that assessment, it gave concrete recommendations and strategies for us to begin operationalizing. I'm going to talk about those in just a minute as I get close to wrapping up. But I do want to talk briefly about the why. And this is the painful part. Okay, why is this important? I begin with this observation that I consider the Public Defender Office actually a race equity initiative itself, because we are in the middle of one of the major indicators of success, which is entanglement in the criminal legal system, and we operate right in the middle of that, trying to help clients ideally. But there's some statistics behind this that we all need to acknowledge. And before I get into these statistics, I want to make a real important point, which is this is not a finger-pointing exercise. Every government agency has played a role in why these statistics look like this. I'll share this point. Chris and Molly did some really incredible work on juvenile de-incarceration. As Chris said, we moved the juvenile hall from about 300 youth per day down to less than 100. Here's the other side of that that's still quite sad and discouraging in some ways. The disproportionality, the ratio of those kids in that hall are exactly the same, if not worse today. So you got 300 down to 100, but the percentages I'm about to show you are going to say we still have a lot of work to do, and all of us play a role. So this isn't pointing fingers at any particular agency. It's asking ourselves, why is this happening and how do we attack this problem? Here are some of the stats. Usually I have this kind of all flow up here, but I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on this, which is statistically, the Public Defender Office represents 80 to 85% of all people facing criminal charges. They have to financially qualify for our services. So that means our criminal legal system is 80 to 85% poor people. That's the first observation. 76% of our clients, now these statistics change a little bit year by year, but they're basically always roughly in this area. 76% of all of our adult clients are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Okay, I want to compare that to the county population. 12% of our clients are Black, while they are 3% or slightly 3% of our standing population. 55% of our clients are Latinx, while they're only about 35% of the population. 83% of our juvenile clients are BIPOC. 10% are Black, again, 3% of the population. 68% are Latinx, again, about 35% of the county population. Juvenile arrests and citations, about 68% Latinx and about 7% Black. Juvenile hall population, this is what I was referring to before, 77% Latinx, about 11% Black or African American. 77% of the people this county has sent to state prison, sitting in state prison right now, 77% of those people are BIPOC, about 55% Latinx, about 16% Black. So we got about 3,000 people up there in our state prisons, and 77% of them are BIPOC. 91% of our immigrant clients are BIPOC, about 24% are from our AAPI community. The last stat I put up there is a little bit of that inward-facing conversation, which is in 2022, the state bar admittees, new lawyers, only 6% were Latinx. 35% of our state population. We have, and I know Chris has spent a lot of time, and we talk a lot about this, about how do we build a better pipeline both into the legal profession and into our offices. I think there's been some great progress, but at the statewide level, we have a lot of work to do. Okay. I'm getting close to kind of wrapping up. This is really my last meaningful slide, which is, well, what the heck is the Public Defender Office doing? You've told us about this problem, you've told us about some sort of commitment, but do you really actually have a plan? And so this is what our plan has been over the last couple years, and in particular a phased plan. Beginning in 2021, we really leaned into the normalization process. Which is educational phase and building the plan, building what this phase process was going to look like. We spent some time doing structural racism 101. You know, everyone starts at a different place and how much they know about this, and honestly, their resistance to accept that this is real. We did critical race theory training. We did de-biasing training for ourselves as well. And the good news is the State Bar requires us to do de-biasing training at least once every 2 years. I don't think that's enough, but it is progress, at least at the State Bar level. Phase 2 began in 2022. We began to expand this training series, and I'd like to highlight this point. This is one of the things that I'm proud of, is we began by training all of our formal leadership before we asked any other line staff to participate. We needed to send a message to our line staff that you aren't going to have to do anything we haven't already done and gone through ourselves. And so leadership, I think, begins really with the leaders, right? So that was part of our training plan. We began some of our initiatives. There's reference to, we ended up seeking and obtaining through the Board of Supervisors support a dedicated Racial Justice Act attorney to help us litigate these issues. We did start our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, and in part that was out of that baseline assessment and a recommendation. And then we moved into phase 3 in 2023 and 2024, where we again began applying the equity tools. We completed the baseline assessment. There was a county-wide employee equity survey to evaluate employees' knowledge and readiness to get involved in this work, and we established our own office equity, race equity steering committee to lead the work. Because when we got done with the baseline assessment, there were a handful of very clear themes. One, our office needed more training. And so we've invested in a lot of training and organizing training and advertising training. I'm proud to say that in about the last 6 to 9 months, we have some training related to race and race equity work almost every other week. Okay, that's not all just internal training, it's how we network throughout the state, but that is major progress in my mind in terms of getting our collective baseline educational level up. We began thinking about communication and transparency. We realized that people actually didn't know a lot of the good work we've been doing, and we're trying to do better in communicating that both out into the community, internally in our office. So we've talked about overhauling our website, beginning with newsletters about the important work we do, and continuing to think about how we can better communicate with both the community and our office. Last 2 things, we've dipped into a data project, and boy, did I have no idea the can of worms I was opening up trying to think about collection and managing data on race equity. And here it is in a nutshell, is race is real, but race is not biologically associated. Okay, so race changes as a social construct over time, and the best example of that is go look at the census each 10 years. We're all categorized differently and it evolves. What that means is all our data systems have been built at different times, they're at a different age, they use different nomenclature, so we can't collectively as a county talk about our same clients in the same way. We're working towards a county-wide standard. I'm hoping to get involved and support that. We are doing that internally in our office, and we're trying to do it in a culturally competent way. In particular, relying on self-report rather than what kind of flows upstream for all of us. Someone puts it in the data system 10 years ago, and that becomes your identity. We don't want to do that anymore. So this is part of our kind of data collection process. And then just building the infrastructure, right? Sustainability. This is my part about this is not a flavor of the month. If we build a sustainable infrastructure, it doesn't matter if Molly's the public defender anymore. It doesn't matter if I'm sitting in my seat anymore. The goal is so that when we aren't in leadership of the office, this work continues. And so we're really trying to have a mind and an eye towards sustainability. So that's really what I wanted to share. Usually my last slide, but I kind of stole my own. Wrap up is the sprint versus marathon versus relay race. I really appreciate you all welcoming and your patience on a Friday night with me. Thanks so much.